Hello everyone and welcome to Bradford Literature Festival's digital programme. So today I'll be talking to William Sieghart. William is a CBE and a British entrepreneur, publisher and philanthropist, and also the founder of the Forward Poetry Prizes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. My name is Emily Zobel Marshall. I'm a reader in post-colonial literature at the School of Cultural Studies at Leeds Beckett University. So welcome, William. It's lovely to have you here with us.
Thank you, Emily. Nice to meet you.
You too. And I've been really enjoying your two books, The Poetry Pharmacy and The Poetry Pharmacy Returns. But before we dive into talking about the books, I just wanted to ask you about your love of poetry. As I understand it, you've loved poetry from an early age, and I was wondering if you could remember the first poem that really moved you.
Gosh, I probably can't, because I had quite a lot read to me when I was tiny, and I don't really remember where it first hit me. But what did first hit me was that in that strange way that some Brits behaved, at the age of 8, I was bundled off to a little boarding school the other side of the country. And really, really miserable and unhappy, as any 8-year-old might be, separated from his family and being sent to a place where no one loves you, which at that age is pretty challenging. The one thing they decided I could do is read a poem aloud, and I won the Hampshire Under-11 Latin poetry reading competition, and I won 10 shillings, which gives you an idea of just how old I am. So that's sort of where my first memories come from.
And that's interesting to, the trauma of the difficulties faced by being at boarding school. Already poetry was being used as a kind of balm to heal some of those.
Yes, I think I was self-medicating from an early age, to use a more modern phrase.
And in 1992, as we mentioned earlier, you set up the Forward Prizes for Poetry, which is awarded to poets in the UK. And I wonder what drove you to establish that prize?
I'll tell you what, I was given a book on my 30th birthday by an old friend, and it was a second-hand book from a second-hand bookshop, and it was called the Guinness Book of Poetry. And I'd grown up with the Guinness Book of Records, but I'd no idea there'd ever been a Guinness Book of Poetry. And it turned out that a member of the Guinness family was a poet, a man called Brian Moyne, and he'd persuaded them to invest some of the lucre from their delicious stout into a bit of art sponsorship. And with that came the Guinness Prize, and with the Guinness Prize came an annual anthology called the Guinness Book of Poetry. And I was so intrigued and delighted to read this, partly because it had in it, right from the start, a lot of poems I'd learned as a child, like "This is the night train crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order," and so on. But it was stunning to see them arrayed in that kind of Top of the Pops way of all coming out in the same year or so. And I'd never looked at poetry in that way, and I was intrigued. And I knew somebody who worked at Guinness, and I got an introduction to their head of corporate affairs, and I rang them up, and I was a little publisher by then, had a tiny little publishing business. And I said, "I've got this brilliant idea. I think you should revive the Guinness Prize. Can I come and talk to you about it?" And they said, "No." And that's where the Forward Prize really began.
And what sort of gaps do you think that the Forward Prize then filled? You talked about the Guinness Prize, but what gaps in your view needed to be filled in terms of poetry prizes at that time?
Well, big gaps actually, because the only time you really saw poetry mentioned in the media was about a bunch of bickering poets in the Poetry Society who had mishandled and mismanaged the finances of the Poetry Society that had a rather beautiful building in Earl's Court, and as a result the building had to be sold. And really you saw very little attention to poetry in the media at all. Poetry wasn't in a particularly healthy shape. It was in a way managed and run by half a dozen middle-aged, middle-class white men who were the poetry editors of the few publishers that published contemporary poetry, and it was a narrow little world. And my goal with the Forward Book of Poetry and with the Forward Prizes was to try and take poetry out of that fusty, dusty, back of a bookshop elite thing and try and make it contemporary and accessible to everyone again. And I can't tell you how sort of barren the support of poetry was, but in the early 90s.
And we've seen some wonderful winners of that prize, and one that springs to mind is Kai Miller with The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion. I've been teaching my students on the course.
He's a genius, absolute genius, isn't he?
And I teach post-colonial literature, so that book is just ideal. And I think many of the students, for the first time, they read this conversation between the cartographer and the Rastaman, and it all starts to click into place. So I'm always thankful to Kai Miller for doing that for us.
Well, I think also what's really exciting about Kai's arrival on the scene, and one or two others at just about that kind of moment, it really inspired poets from all over the world, and made them feel, well, if a guy from Jamaica can do it, I can do it. And as a result, the voices are so much more diverse and so much more interesting over the last, say, decade or so that have come through in the prize.
Yes. And we've seen a shift, haven't we, in terms of poetry and its accessibility. And we'll talk a bit more about how your work comes into that. But it seems to me that there's a lot more of a poetry scene, that it does seem more accessible to people, that we see more spoken word, poetry, slams. With social media, we have people sharing poetry, Insta poetry. So there is a kind of perhaps a democratization of poetry taking place. Would you agree with that?
Oh, completely, absolutely. And poetry book sales have sort of, I don't know, doubled in 5 years or something extraordinary. And it's all thanks to social media. It's all thanks to the Rupi Kaurs of this world, who've built their own following and then got chased by publishers saying, oh, I'll do your book. And what social media has done is completely, trying to think of the right metaphor for it, but I talked about a narrow funnel before of these half a dozen poetry editors. Suddenly that funnel's gone because social media takes the funnel away. Anyone can be their own publisher. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, it gives the poet control, doesn't it? Without having to
which maybe before, I used to get endless letters and emails from people saying, how do I get my poetry? How do I break into poetry? And I'd go, you've got to try and get a poem or two in a journal here or there, and maybe a publisher will pick you up. But that's not a very satisfactory answer. This is a much better way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, William, you also have established the National Poetry Day in 1994, which is a kind of fixture in our calendar now. I was interested in how does one go about establishing a national day, and and again, what was the sort of source of inspiration behind trying to do this?
Well, actually, I owe a lot to a rather extraordinary man called Ed Victor. Ed Victor was a famous literary agent in London. He was born a poor boy in Brooklyn, and he ended up in London in the publishing world and became the kind of, I think he was known as the Uber agent, because he'd sign everyone up from prime ministers to God knows what else and get incredible advances for their books. And one day I met him and I introduced a young talented writer who was my best friend at university, Will Self, to him. And that went, as you can imagine, quite well, because we know who Will Self is today. And he took me out to lunch to say thank you. And he didn't know me from Adam, really. And I must have been in my mid-20s, late 20s. And he asked me to lunch at London's Groucho Club, which to me was possibly the most exciting thing I'd ever done in my life up until then. And he asked me about my plans in my life. And I told him about the idea for the Forward Prizes. And he said, Will, you need Maggie Drabble and Stephen Spender as your judges. And I said, well, yes, that would be a good start, wouldn't it? And 2 days later, he rang me up and he said, I've got them. You'll never have problem getting a judge again. And thereafter, my father died that year, and thereafter, he became a kind of avuncular figure in my life. And a year later, we went out to lunch again, and he said, what's your next plan? And I said, well, I've had this idea for National Poetry Day. And he said, well, you should meet Alan Yentab. I had no idea who Alan Yentab was, but he turned out to be the creative director of the BBC. And he took me to see Alan Yentab, who, bless him, said right away, that's a good idea. And in those days, there weren't any national days. I'm not even sure there was a national no smoking day. So it was a bit finger in the air as an idea. But what was really lovely, at the end of the first year, I got an email, or probably not an email in those days, a letter from someone saying, I really enjoyed National Poetry Day. It was so much better than last year. And I thought, well, given this is the first, this plainly fits people's imagination. And what I'd began to discover is that as a nation, we love our poetry, but we're a little bit coy and shy about it, depending on our cultural background, of course. Our Irish cousins would belt one out in a bar and get bought a drink. If you belted out a poem in a bar in certain parts of London when I grew up, you might get a thump in the head. So in a way, what Poetry Day was doing was allowing people to be poetic and to turn to their loved one and say, shall I compare thee? Or to abseil down a building, burbling out a poem. It didn't really matter. It was a chance to be poetic and enthusiastic and eccentric without needing an excuse. And I think that the, kind of reticence that particularly the Anglo-Saxon world has about being emotional and talking and sharing their love of things could be broken with this little label National Poetry Day. In the same way, I hope that I've broken some of the fears people had about poetry by doing it in a pharmaceutical way with an introduction to each poem, which takes away a bit of the fear of the P word.
Yes, exactly. And that fear of the P word, as you say, there is this reticence, emotional kind of blockage maybe in a lot of British people in terms of sharing their emotions. But with poetry, there tends to be this sense that it's something, that if you're not a part of the literary world, that somehow you won't get it, that somehow it's not for you. It's still part of this kind of high culture. And you need to have had an education, be a sort of an intellectual to fully understand it. So it's interesting because you're very well connected yourself, but actually, you're trying to perhaps peel back some of that privilege that is perceived as necessary to understand poetry and make it much more accessible.
Yeah, it's for everyone. But there's something about its branding, its image, its story, our history with it, particularly growing up here and going to school here, which kind of puts you off. I think most of poetry's middle people, as in teachers, booksellers, librarians, are pretty intimidated by poetry themselves, and that doesn't help. If you don't have someone to pass the baton to you to take away the fear, poetry, like classical music, can be really scary. And it's amazing how intimidated people are. And I've often said when I've been doing chats or in my books, don't let it intimidate you, read it out aloud. And when I say out aloud, if you're on the bus, obviously not out aloud, but in your head, a bit like you'd be murmuring the lyrics to a pop song in your head. You don't read it like a piece of journalism or a novel or whatever. Hear it, because then the musicality and the rhythm come out. But also do it lots of times. Great art doesn't necessarily reveal itself instantly. Think how often in life you've gone and bought, well, sorry, I'm a lot older than you, but I used to go out and buy a vinyl single because I'd heard it on Radio 1 or Capital or whatever, and I'd be really, really excited by it. And then it was amazing how quickly it became too saccharine and I couldn't listen to it ever again. And actually what became the tough track on the end of side 2, which seemed rather weird, ended up being my favorite song of all. Sometimes art takes a while, and if you're patient with it, the more rewarding it will become. And it could be really rewarding for life, so it's worth it.
As I give the same advice to my students as well, that, like, as you say, read it either out aloud or aloud in your head. And it's interesting, isn't it, how in those sort of British literary traditions have put poetry on a pedestal, but where you have cultures which are perhaps more seeped already in the oral, we were talking about Kai Miller, for example, where you that kind of poetry, Caribbean poetry, it perhaps, is already more accessible and more connected to the people without having been a part of that literary establishment in the same way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, depending on what culture you originate from. Some cultures poetry is so much more central and without these problems. The Irish, good example. The Arab world, good example, where Arabic is such a poetic language, and the flowing into poetry is completely, it doesn't seem odd in any way at all in conversation.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so, William, I've got your two wonderful editions here of the Poetry Pharmacy. So we have the first one, which is tried and true prescriptions for the heart, mind, and soul, and then the second one, more prescriptions for courage, healing, and hope. And when they arrived in the post, I must say they're very beautiful. They're so aesthetically pleasing, and my children were immediately like, what is this? And I said, oh, they're poetry books. And my son went, oh, and my daughter went, oh, because she really enjoys poetry. But Stephen Fry says, here is balm for the soul, fire for the belly, an arm around the lonely shoulder. And it's a wonderful idea, it's a wonderful premise, that you are prescribing poetry for the ills, people's sort of, heartache and the ills of society. Tell us a bit about how you started out, because as I understand it, it started in a festival and a friend set you up in a tent and you were giving prescriptions to people.
Yes, it was all by mistake, all a bit, like that. I'd done the prize, I'd done Poetry Day for seemingly decades. And then one day, a wonderful friend who I was working with called Jenny Dyson had the job of programming a literary festival, like the Bradford Literary Festival, but unlike the Bradford Literary Festival, it was in Cornwall, and it was based around one rather extraordinary old house in Cornwall with lots of beautiful gardens around it. So it was a sort of summer outdoor thing, and with a lot of tents and a lot of people camping. And she's got me to speak about poetry, and she said, I've designed you a pad. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you're always prescribing me poems to get me through difficult moments in my life. And so I'm setting you up to do a poetry pharmacy. And here's your prescription pad. And it's a fantastic thing with, well, I've got one right in front of me. But, it actually says, take this to the poetry pharmacy. I think you can probably see that.
Yes.
Yeah. Consultant professor.
Number on it.
When this arrived in the mail, I thought, oh my God, this is proper. And she said, okay, photocopy as many poems as you can think of that could be really helpful to people. So I photocopied about 50, and I got one of those sort of filofax things, and I put them into each one just in case. And then after my talk, she put me in a little tent with an armchair and a couch. And then outside the tent was a blackboard, and you could book your slots. And I thought I'd do, I think there were 10 or 15-minute slots. I thought I'd do it for an hour. 5 hours later, with an incredibly full bladder, I took a break, and I popped out the tent, and there was a queue. And what's more, the blackboard was full. And I suddenly realized that Jenny had come up with the most extraordinary idea. I'd spent all my adult life trying to get poetry out of Poetry Corner, as we called it. And suddenly here was the answer. And I also needed a couple of boxes of tissues, because I found that at least half the people who came to talk to me poured out their heart, but also poured out their tears. And I felt incredibly moved and humbled that people would want to come and tell me their worries. But I also felt incredibly fulfilled when I got the prescription right, when I got the poem right, and they seemed to get up off the couch a foot taller. And I had my email address on the prescription pad, and by the end of the weekend, I started getting emails from people going, that was really helpful, thank you. So right away, I had the feedback that this was something a bit different. And then somebody who'd been at the festival worked for the BBC. And the next thing I got, they got in touch and said, would I go on their Saturday morning show on Radio 4 with the Reverend Richard Coles? And so I said, sure. And the producer of the program, when we were doing it live, kept saying, oh my God, I've never seen so many requests come in our program. And so then they asked me back at Christmas to do the same thing, and on it went. So Jenny's brilliant, simple idea really crossed over 25 years, 20 years hard work. Suddenly, the Poetry Pharmacy was born, and the journey goes on and on and on. It's absolutely fascinating where it's leading me.
And so it's poetry as a form of catharsis, isn't it? And it perhaps is rooted in that kind of therapeutic exchange, the talking cure, as Freud put it, where we are able to put our emotions into words either through reading or listening to poetry. There's something about that, you know, the ability to narrate pain and trauma that people connect with.
Yes, and I would say that there is a lot of poetry in the liturgies of every faith. And for those who are still religious and meeting communally and sharing texts, that's a little bit about what's going on. But in the increasingly secular world, the canon of poetry has in some way become the secular liturgy. And during the isolation and difficulty of lockdown, I found my social media filled with selections from this canon, with people trying to help each other.
Because your second collection comes out in 2019, doesn't it? So but it's before the with the pandemic. Do you think that you'll then need to have a third collection that responds to the health crisis?
I think a third collection would be a lovely thing to do. I put an email address in the back of both books saying what inspires you, what poems changed your life. And I have box files, this sort of, you know, full of them. And so it's made the research much easier. In some ways, though, I feel that most of the issues I dealt with in books 1 and 2 were lockdown issues. You know, they're fundamentally about loneliness, anxiety, can't sleep, can't find the point in it, all of those kinds of things. And what I found really intriguing, you know, having written them in 2016, 17, 18, written the books, that actually so often when I look back now, I said to people, get out, go for a walk, find nature. These things will change your life. Simple shafts of light in the right place. All those kinds of things, which actually in retrospect for lockdown were probably just right, given how little else we could do.
Yes. And William, there's a poetry pharmacy shop. Is that linked to you?
It's not linked to me. It's run by a woman who started a thing called the Poetry Ambulance about the same time, and she does. I'd hate to say she does what I do. Maybe I should say I do what she does. But she, like me, believes that poetry can be unbelievably helpful and really transformational for difficult moments. And she's taken her ambulance and made a poetry pharmacy shop. She's sort of, instead of being quite on the move, she's now based there, and she's produced wonderful anthologies. And in her shop, I haven't yet been because it's in Shropshire and it's all been locked down and all of that, but I hear wonderful things and would encourage anyone anywhere near it to go and visit.
Well, William, I'm going to ask you if you would read a poem for us in a moment, but just you know, as you mentioned, in your collections you have, so there's I'm just going to see if so there's a page where you have the poem, and then there's a page of analysis. Well, it's not analysis, is it? It's insight, really, from you. So about the poem on the other page. So I was interested in how you decided to interpret the poem and to share your thoughts on the poem, because I think you try and avoid to make it like literary analysis, but rather it's quite from the heart, isn't it? Your reflections on each poem.
Yes, there's no literary analysis there at all, to be honest. I'm not gifted enough for that. No, what premises the whole thing on the top left of the spread is a word, and that word might well say anxiety, loneliness. It's a condition. It says condition, lethargy, convalescence, emotional baggage, or whatever. And just underneath it, it also says, also suitable for, and the one I'm looking at says apathy, boredom, messiness, need for self-care, and so on. And then a page I've written in a way about the condition, but also about why this poem that you're about to read might help you with that condition. I suppose the closest thing to literary analysis is helping you a little bit in what I think the poet is saying, but not much more than that. You know, I'll give you a good example. Yes. And actually, this is a tiny one, but I'm interested by the fact that in the 19th century, in this country, people were really obsessed when, say, Tennyson's latest book came out, because there was no accessible culture at all. You know, if you wanted to see a painting, hear an orchestra, you had to go to a big city. And for living in most parts of the country, you just couldn't get your hands on anything. In the post-war 20th century, the poets got kind of subsumed into other cultures, and lyricists became, you know, people say Van Morrison, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen's a poet, all this kind of stuff. I found this bit of poetry from the words from a musical, a Broadway musical. But you'll know these words, all of you will know these words, because you'll have heard them sung on your telly. And it's just 6 little lines, and I encourage people to learn them off by heart if they haven't from singing that song. And think of it, when life is really tough and you're really struggling, these lines should course through your veins. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain. Though your dreams be tossed and blown, walk on with hope in your heart. And you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone.
Yes, beautiful. And it's about the meditation on those words, isn't it? That it's the poetic form allows you the space to really, rather than just hear something that you've heard and your mind kind of goes, oh yes, I know that, you know, puts it to one side. This is about pausing and really absorbing the message.
Yes, it is. And I mean, that's a very sort of simple one that deals with courage and coping when perhaps you think that, you know, there is no hope for anything at all. But I will try and give you one now that, you know, deals with a dilemma, with an issue.
Which page are you on?
I'm on page 78, and this is a poem by Sheena Pugh, and it's called What If This Road? And one of the things that really strikes me when people come and talk to me about their worries, and I've listened to thousands of people now, is how often fear of the future, or fear of the future paralyzes. And it needn't. The newspapers these days are filled so often with headlines about what's about to happen rather than what has happened. The storm, the incredible weather we're going to get next week, whatever it is, but it's never quite, you know, somehow or other, it's winding people up. And I found this incredible poem by Sheena Pugh, What If This Road? And it's all about, in a way, not quite glass half empty, half full, but just thinking about the future in a different way. Here we go. What if this road, that has held no surprises these many years, decided not to go home after all? What if it could turn left or right, with no more ado than a kite tail? What if its tarry skin were like a long, supple bolt of cloth that is shaken and rolled out and takes a new shape from the contours beneath? And if it chose to lay itself down in a new way, around a blind corner, across hills you must climb without knowing what's on the other side, who would not hanker to be going at all risks? Who wants to know a story's end, or where a road will go?
Beautiful.
Isn't it?
And this is condition, fear of the unknown, also suitable, fear for the future and fear of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a bit, William, of the poem that you have of the poem in the second volume on page 7. Now that all your worry, just 3 lines. Now that all your worry has provided such an unlucrative business, why not find a better job? I love that.
Well, I love that too, because it was written, you know, 700 and something years ago by Hafiz, who in my mind is the greatest poet that's ever lived. And if you're Iranian, you'll have a book of Hafiz's poetry in your home, and that'll do, thank you very much. You know, his work is a pharmacy in itself.
and thinking about how those same worries, those sort of human, trials and tribulations, they resurface, across the centuries, don't they, and across cultures. So,
well, absolutely. But I think fundamentally, what the whole point of this is that if you find a poem that gives you a sense of complicity with how you feel, you're not alone. You're not mad, and what's more, if it was written hundreds of years ago, we've always felt like this. And so it normalizes what's going on in your head. There's a brilliant quote by Alan Bennett, which I put in the introduction. He says, the best moments in reading are where you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you thought special and particular to you. Now here it is, set down by someone else, a person you have never met, someone even who is long dead, and it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. Says it all, doesn't it?
And it speaks to that desire for connection, doesn't it?
Yes, correct.
Human connection.
Yeah.
What has been, out of all the difficulties that you've heard when you've been prescribing poetry, is there one particular human ailment, emotional ailment that comes up more than others?
Yes, loneliness.
I thought you were going to say that.
And it seems to me extraordinary, in a world where we have more platforms to communicate with each other than ever, we seem to be lonelier than ever. And I think it's because of this digital diversion which goes on. You see everyone in front of their screens all day long. They're actually engaged in a kind of schizophrenia. They have to put another person up on this social media, which isn't really them. It's a sort of avatar. It's a kind of how they want to be seen to be, or how they think they should be seen to be. But despite the fraudulence of all of that, they don't see through everyone else's fraudulence, and then get intimidated by parties they haven't been asked to, likes that they're not getting, friends that they don't seem to have any longer, all those kinds of things. And it makes people feel very small and very lonely. And if you think of the impact on adults of this, what do you think it does to an 11-year-old? I'm the first generation, as you might say, or the generation that had children most exposed to digital too early. And in retrospect, I wish I kept them well away from it. It's like a terrible loss of innocence, far too early in life. And its impact on the psyche, well, we won't know for a very, very, very long time. But I grew up in the 70s, and lockdown reminded me actually a little bit of that, of my mother's voice going, life is boring and you just have to learn to live with it. All that kind of stuff that encouraged.
Only boring people get bored.
Only boring people get bored. All those things. But you see, for my children, they don't get bored, because when they're bored, they turn to a gadget, or to a screen, to the web and everything else. But that in itself, well, we won't go on about its potential impact. I'm losing my thread. I'm trying to think what you asked me in the first.
My 11-year-old, you're just making me think of my own 11-year-old, it was a constant battle with the phone, and to try and get him off the phone. And I try and say to him, similarly to you, I grew up in a pre-internet generation, and he says, oh, Mum, your life sounded so boring. All you did was read books in trees. But I try and talk to him about poetry. He also says, Mum, don't you know, poetry's dead. so I'm on a mission to try and get him engaged in poetry.
Well, tell him then rap is dead. And,
that's what I know.
The lyrics of contemporary music are dead, The problem is the categorization of the P word, exactly, not the content. And so enthusiasts like me are just trying to break down that, the fear and the categorization and all of that. And as I say, try and get poetry out of Poetry Corner, because it deserves it.
What do you think about, what have you observed in terms of poetry during the pandemic? Because there's been a lot of pandemic poems, haven't there? There've been pandemic collections. People have responded to this isolation and this crisis in poetic form. That seems to be quite a lot more poetry on social media. But I was just, what sort of changes have you observed? And also, have you been inundated with more requests?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. It's been quite overwhelming, to be honest. By the time I got to January this year, every time I engaged with someone one-on-one on a Zoom call, I would always say, "How are you? How's your mental health?" And people would pour their hearts out. Now, a year or two ago, if I'd begun any conversation like that with almost anyone I didn't know or hardly knew, I think they would have felt that was a slightly inappropriate way to begin. And what's more, to ask somebody how their mental health was would just, unless you were a mental health professional in those specific circumstances, is not something that you do. Now it seems to be completely normal to do it, and to do it to men too, who don't necessarily find it so easy to talk about themselves and how they feel. So yes, the world has changed really dramatically. Yes, poetry has played a really important part in that. As I said, in part because I think of this sort of secular liturgy thing, this sense of people sharing bits of poetry to help each other through very, very difficult times psychologically. But then there's also the fact that people have been writing about it in a different way too, and that social media or the technologies of social media have allowed them to spread it around as well. Poetry, I think, is the art form that always gets there first. It doesn't have that image, but the winner of the first Forward Prize in 1992 was Tom Gunn with his extraordinary collection, The Man with Night Sweats. And that was the first artistic engagement with AIDS. Long before Princess Diana was shaking hands, long before any other art form engaged with this as an issue, Tom Gunn, who lived in San Francisco where AIDS really took hold, dealt with it in the way that poets always do deal with these issues first, because you only need a pencil and paper, or in the modern world, a keyboard. You don't need anything else. You don't need an ensemble orchestra or an ensemble studio set or movie team or any of these various other things to help. You can just get it on out there. So I've always felt poetry is on the front line of everything. And one of the pleasures I've had in lockdown is assembling the last 10 forward books of poetry and turning them into one book called Poems of the Decade, which is going to come out on National Poetry Day. And it's it's my version of what I think are the best poetry from the last 10 books. And I'm really delighted that the previous version of that is the A-level set text for people doing English at A-level. One of the examinations board has had it for many years now. And the fact that this frontline presence of poetry and poets getting out there and then actually being studied for A-level, maybe 3, 4, 5 years after the poem has been written, gives you that sense of how contemporary and urgent poetry is, which, let's face it, is not as an art form its image. But that's the truth, that's the reality of it, and that's what really, really excites me.
That's great, and it's great to see the A-level syllabus also, responding to that, because in some ways you could argue that GCSE and A-level syllabus haven't quite caught up with some of this, the diversity in poetry that we see today, and reflection on those contemporary issues. You advise in terms of reading a poem. You say to people, well, if you feel you don't understand a poem at first, then keep reading it. Try and read it every night. Read it before you go to bed. Read it when you get up in the morning. And every time that you read the poem, you will see and feel something different. And soon you'll start to, be able to move around in it, to feel it, to understand it.
And the missing word is hear. Hear it.
And hear it. And hear it. And you think, William, do you, in that way that everybody has the ability to connect? Would you say with or find something in poems which are perhaps seemingly very dense or impenetrable to begin with?
Well, I don't recommend the world's most dense and impenetrable poems to start your poetic career. Leave the four quartet towards the end. But I'm somebody who's obviously spent my life involved in poetry, and I lost my mother a couple of years ago. And when I was trying to deal with all her things, the hardest thing was dismantling her book collection, because she was a very well-read and learned person, and somehow the books just seemed to make her character up one way or another. And I found, slightly moist-eyed as I was looking at these books, trying to work out what I was going to do, a very slim volume, and I pulled it out, and it was the Four Quartets. And many, many years ago, my mother, knowing I loved T.S. Eliot, had taken me to a performance of the Four Quartets by Michael Gough and Eileen Atkins and Edward Fox in a West End theatre. And it was utterly mesmerizing, and so much so that when we went out for a little meal afterwards, we couldn't speak to each other. We just had nothing to say. We'd absorbed so much. And I then took that home, and during my grieving months, rather than wear a black armband, as you might say, I stayed in, and I found myself learning half the Four Quartets. I learned 700 lines off by heart, and in the process really began to inhabit this poem. And as you do when you learn poetry off by heart, because you have to say it every day and the words keep sticking with you. And my wife is a documentary filmmaker, and one day she said, "Oh, I know that poem." She said, "Years ago I made a film about a Carmelite nunnery, and the order of Carmelite nuns were silent order, so they didn't speak, but every day they'd go into their library to meditate. And do you know what they used to meditate on? The Four Quartets." And I found that to be an immensely helpful and reassuring fact. But also, I found the learning those 700 lines an incredibly helpful way to process an extraordinary period of emotional and spiritual anguish. And I can't claim to understand every word of what I've read, but even as people would say from, I think, every religious culture, they don't necessarily fully think and understand the full liturgy that they have recited communally, but they know it and they've recited it communally, and that's half the battle.
Yes. Well, William, I went to visit my late mother's grave just before coming here, and I was wondering if perhaps you could prescribe me a poem. We've been talking about memory and loss and grief and remembering. Is there anything in one of your books that you could share which speaks to that?
Of course I would. How long ago did you lose your mum?
It was 2 years ago now.
Same as me. It's a very painful thing, isn't it? And I think bereavement is something that comes in waves. And just when you sort of feel you've slightly put the worst behind you, it floods again. And I think the most beautiful poem for visiting a grave is by Mary Elizabeth Fry. "Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am the thousand winds that blow. I am the diamond glints on snow. I am the sun on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. When you awaken in the morning's hush, I am the swift uplifting rush of quiet birds in circling flight. I am the soft starlight at night. Do not stand at my grave and cry. I am not there. I did not die."
It's so moving. And I was thinking of I couldn't remember the whole poem, but I did think of that line, "I am not there," when I was there today, because she has this huge mountain, she has this huge kind of growth of flowers on her grave. All the other graves are really neatly cut, and then my mum's grave is just full of flowers that I've planted there, and I thought, she's there in those flowers rather than
But she's there in you. She's there everywhere. She brought you, she raised you, she taught you how to appreciate the love of eating a sweet pear, or how to make a salad, or this dish or that. She's ever present. She's not buried and lost. And as my dad used to put it beautifully, but just before he died, he said to me, you know what? He said, when I'm gone, he said, you'll still hear my voice. It just won't annoy you anymore. And I thought it was such a brilliant way of expressing that. And the power of a remarkable mother, and all our mothers are remarkable to us, is there for forever and forevermore, not just in that physical place. When you go to that physical place, of course, her remains are there, and that physical place reminds you of that. But actually, she remind you, things remind you of your mother all day, every day, everywhere.
Yes, yeah, they do. They do, and she's there actually behind us, looking over as a child in the portrait. William, thank you. And to those of you who are watching, please look, check out the poetry prescriptions in William's wonderful books. And can I just say, William, it's been an absolute pleasure to be talking to you for the digital programme of the Bradford Literature Festival.
It's been my great pleasure to meet you, Emily. Thank you very much.
Thank you.